Yes, I get to introduce the article today about the megachurch pastor who was caught with his pants down. The article today comes from the Daily Beast, and we have 41-year-old charismatic Pastor Tavner Smith, who is a married or was a married gentleman with kids. He was recently caught having an affair with one of his church employees. So the people in his congregation obviously were really shocked by this. I don't think any of us are particularly shocked by this. The history of this relationship goes back a few years to 2020, where people started in his congregation started having some suspicions that something was going on with one of his female employees at the church. But in November, members from his church caught him and the other lady at his house in their undergarments. He quickly went to try to cover up and try to make an excuse for this, saying that they were cooking chili and that they had spilled the chili on their clothes, and that is why he was in his boxers and she was in a towel. Obviously, this is another case that we've seen many times happen in these mega churches. The response from his congregation is pretty split over this. Half of the congregation is kind of shocked, like this is out of nowhere. The other half feels obviously quite betrayed by this. I don't think any of us are very shocked by this. This gentleman was a prosperity gospel pastor, so he obviously had a history of kind of a position in his church where he would ask people for things that we think are pretty unethical, where they would ask for donations and be preaching a type of message that was high pressure, kind of highly emotional. He was known to give sermons based on his personal life, very, very just a very emotional kind of manipulative environment. So my first thought with this whole thing is that we could talk about power dynamics. There are power dynamics even in churches. It's very similar to the power dynamic with an employee-employer, but when you add a religious leader into the mix, they have the added structure of power where they claim to hear from God. Pastor Tavner was no different. He had claimed for many years that he was led into this position because he had heard directly from God. So anything that he kind of makes a decision to do in his church, he's going to have that added bit of control and power and authority over his congregation because he is hearing it from God. So I've seen this happen many times. I think we all have seen this happen. And I think it causes a lot of confusion in the congregation because they're obviously taught to forgive and they're taught to make a bit of room for these mistakes. A lot of the excuses we hear come out of these situations are that someone is kind of a work in progress, or that they have their own sins in their lives and that they are working on it. And so I think that it puts somebody in the congregation in a position where they are kind of forced to choose their ethics system over top of their spiritual system. And if they were to have an issue with his behavior, it might even be interpreted that they are having an issue with God, because like I mentioned earlier, that his authority comes from God. So it's a kind of a messy situation. Obviously, infidelity in that sort of situation is uncomfortable even in a secular situation. But when it comes to these spiritual do as I say, but not as I do kind of situations, it can be really, really uncomfortable and confusing for the congregants. Yeah.
Yeah, I think my first reaction to this was honestly kind of like, if I'm being totally honest, was like, why is anyone surprised? I don't know. I don't know what other reaction to have to this. I feel like that this seems so pervasive in that sort of situation. But I tried to tap into like younger me, who was kind of like maybe the first time I encountered one of those stories when I was still a religious person, and being like, oh my God, they don't hold themselves to the same standard they hold us all to. That's insane. And it is really sad and heartbreaking for those congregants. And I think more than anything for this staff, this female staff who is, I mean, I guess it's hard to say where the line of like abuse is there, but certainly a power dynamic was used to get her in compromising positions. I think that's really where the core of like my empathy and reaction to this situation comes from. But I'm trying to hold back the urge just to put like a shocked Pikachu meme and like leave it at that.
Yeah.
Well, and even if it wasn't an abuse of power, it's definitely an inappropriate relationship, workplace relationship, one way or another, because he was the head of this church. So he's in a position, especially being married, and she was married as well, where any situation like that is going to be inappropriate, especially for him. But I didn't get necessarily the impression that he was using power to sort of rule her in, or kind of get her under his wing. But I did get the impression that that they did it very openly. Almost, they were always hanging out together. She was always in his office. They worked together on stuff, and so there were a lot of rumors well before it was discovered. But I had the same reaction as you, Arden, of this is no big surprise. Why is this even newsworthy? I honestly think what makes it the most newsworthy when I think about it is the way the church can't necessarily absorb, like, they're basically crumbling because their leader was caught doing something that has people have been doing for thousands and thousands and thousands of years, right? Like, it's no big new thing, especially among religious bodies. Like, it's not something that they're immune to. But the church is literally like unable to recover from it. I think we had 3 different articles posted on this same story, and I didn't even really necessarily think it was newsworthy enough for one. I mean, certainly there's lots to talk about in the article, but it played out like a soap opera.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think going along the lines of all of you have said, I mean, there's lots of places we could take this article, because it's quite a funny story at its core, if not for the abuse of power. But it always seems, and I don't know whether you agree or disagree with this, that people who, in every single case when people claim that God is talking directly to them, they always do really well financially out of it. And
Strange.
we don't have any kind of financial records from the church because they don't have to declare it. But when the article goes into his financial background, and it tells us that property records show the building alone is worth 4.9 million. A child support worksheet in Smith's divorce proceedings lists his monthly income as $16,666. According to the divorce records, Smith and his ex-wife owned 3 houses in and around Chattanooga, worth 98. I don't even know how to say that. It's such a huge figure. 981,330, and maintained a real estate investment account worth 20,000. So he's not doing bad out of God talking to him, is he? He's certainly not one of these down and out preachers who's relying only on God's voice to sustain him.
You'd think you'd be more careful when you had that much writing on it. You know, if you're teaching a certain sexual ethic to your congregation, to go and do something completely otherwise that would possibly risk that income, you'd think you would be a little bit more careful with that. But like you said, like the idea that they have this authority from God, a lot of these pastors seem like they think they're untouchable, and I think that they know enough tactics that they can kind of gaslight their congregants or anybody who is close enough to them, even the people that were very, very close and in that inner circle. I feel like the tactics that a lot of these people have to completely manipulate the onlookers too, so that properly kind of frame the situation. Like I had mentioned, like saying that it was I've heard people like I have a sexual sin, or everybody is a sinner. This has been my battle, or whatever. There's so much language around it that it's so easy to manipulate people into not being judgmental and to continue to support you. So that's the part that I think I'm more irritated by. Well, I mean, I am irritated by it all, but that's the part that I see is the saddest, besides the impact on his own family, the impact that it'll have on the people who follow him and who come to, or like view him as an authority figure. They're going to be susceptible to that manipulation as well. Yeah.
It does seem to be a story of kind of two halves to me, because it's clearly a manipulative person. Claiming he's got messages from God, and the article tells us he pretty much went on a recruitment drive to build this church up, and it was all about the money. So there's clearly manipulation there. I do think that regarding the relationship itself, it does seem to come across that something that's kind of blossomed naturally rather than him specifically targeting somebody to manipulate into a relationship. And the article, this bit made me laugh in the article, where it said something about he started growing his hair out and getting piercings, and it and that's when the congregation noticed something was amiss. And I think it sounds to me like he's met this lady. They've kind of it's reinvigorated him, and he's started like changing his appearance to try and like, I don't know, put his alpha male feathers on.
Yeah. I mean, that's a really typical thing. Sorry, Laura. Go ahead.
No. I was just gonna say it just struck me as odd that those things are signs of his slipping, right? Like we see tattoos and piercings and long hair as being sinful or losing their way or losing his grip or getting kind of out of touch. And to me it's just an interesting I don't know, it's sort of interesting that we classify people that way, right? Like, to me, piercings and tattoos and hairstyles are just another way of expressing yourself. They're not a sign of anything positive or negative. And it's interesting that the church, in hindsight, oh, he's having an affair. Oh, well, there was that time where he started growing his hair out. Oh, and then he also got piercings. Oh, we should have seen the whole time, right?
Yeah, like it's not that he was like meeting alone with her in his office and all these other things, other behavioral changes. It's like, oh, he grew his hair out and got a few piercings. Like, that's the most Christian kind of way of framing it I've ever heard.
I think too, it's interesting to think about kind of like, I know we've all maybe got more or less the same impression that he didn't like single this girl out, and it wasn't like a situation where it was like, oh, like God is telling me that you have to be with me or whatever. But there is still like a level of manipulation there too, because I mean, if this was happening openly in front of all of the congregants for a really long time and nobody's calling it out, clearly he has to be doing some sort of misdirection there, and I think, like you pointed out, Erin, like if he's considered like a voice of God in the church, then of course they're going to be like, oh, well, he says nothing's happened, and if he's the most holy of all of us, then we should just trust him that of course nothing bad is happening here. And it is exactly. It's really, really unfortunate. I am curious to know how the people who are still there are able to sit in those seats, and I would love to know what's going on in their minds. Like, they have to be feeling some degree of like dissonance. I don't know how you couldn't be conflicted, especially when there were reports in the article that he was calling like those who left the church the enemy and things like that. It seems to be like almost like this ramped up like cultic language that he's getting into, of like creating a more like dense in group and trying to like frame everything else as the enemy or a threat to what they have.
Yeah, and of course he hasn't actually admitted to this yet, right, according to the article. It's interesting that there is that kind of the split, because some of the congregation have left. Those who the article tells us thought there was something like a soap opera going off with photographs appearing of the meeting in a restaurant together and things like that. And then there are this other side of the congregation who are standing by him and who are, as Arden said, calling the rest of them liars and saying that they kind of it's their fault for spreading these rumors. It's very interesting to me, and I'm also interested in the kind of the cognitive dissonance of those who've left, because it's not shaken their faith. It right. Seems to me from the article, it's this thing has happened, and they're not say it's in no way leading them to say that God doesn't exist or maybe I've been following the wrong religion. They've put it down to this man who has fallen and he's sinned, and even worse than that, they're questioning themselves, saying I let this go on. I'm bad for doing that, and I think that's really sad, and that they've kind of got this dissonance, that they've gone to another church now. They've gone to other churches rather than allowing themselves to question, well, is the faith as a whole wrong?
Yeah, so that's really more where I wanted to focus more than the affair itself, because like I said earlier, the affair just doesn't really strike me as that newsworthy, other than the fact that it's the contradiction of, oh, you must be so pure and you're a sinner if you do these things, but I'm gonna go ahead and do them anyway. Um, but other than that, it's not that newsworthy. But the manipulation of people, not just by pastors like him, but all church organizations, where they have this sense of community, where they manipulate people into, like, people will come in there and they'll change their lives for the better, and they'll attribute it to God, and now suddenly it's like what the community and the people in the church have done is manipulating people into these belief systems that get them stuck, right? So, like what Richard said, um, you have a person who says that he hears God and he's speaking for God, and he gets all these people in, and it's very charismatic, and he gets them all fired up, and then he does something wrong, and they're like, "Well, okay, time to leave to a new church." But they never question, well, was what he was teaching us even true to begin with? And one of the quotes that I wanted to talk about was really just like, how the system takes advantage of people, and how the system takes people when they're at their worst and sort of builds them up, and then makes them kind of dependent on it. And so one of the quotes from the article was, another former attendee broke down in tears, talking about how the church had helped her turn her life around and how lost she felt without it. Before she joined the venue, she said she drank, cursed, and was generally a mean person. Attending had helped her find her true self, she said, or at least she'd thought. And now she didn't know what to think. Right. And so, I mean, it's good. There are some people who are actually questioning the belief system around it. But it's really sad to think that it's not just about helping people, it's about helping people and adding all this manipulation on top of it, to where when that rug is pulled out from underneath them, they have nowhere to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's I just see layer upon layer upon layer of manipulation. Manipulation to get them in the door, manipulation while they're there, manipulation when things go wrong. Just the very fact that there is anybody in the congregation who's taking any kind of blame for his behavior shows me that there's been abuse. Like that is a form of abuse, when somebody feels like they're in that position where they've done something wrong based on someone else's behavior. And then, manipulation on their way out. So if somebody leaves the church, or if somebody leaves the church or leaves the faith, they're going to get, fingers pointed at them of why they left, and they weren't supportive, they weren't forgiving. If they decide to, take those doubts a little further and question their belief, they're going to get told that they didn't have a theologically sound, view of faith, that they had a bad experience, and that they just gave up on their faith. Like, it's just, the manipulation just continues over and over again, and it compounds on itself. And it's really, really hurtful to see. As somebody who's an ex-Christian, like, I feel like I can sit in that mindset of exactly how those people are feeling, and feeling the intense dissonance, and trying to compartmentalize it, trying to see where how can I explain this? How can I maybe blame myself? There's many avenues on how they can cope with it, and most of them seem really unhealthy.
I hope that, like, going forward, people who are maybe they're consider themselves Christian, they just don't take it that seriously, or they're not like super strict on themselves, or maybe people who are more kind of ambiguous about this stuff, like, can see a story like this and look back on how frequent these things happen, and hopefully kind of try to integrate that into, like, the way they operate around Christians and Christianity in general. Because I think there really still is this, like, pervasive thing, at least in American culture, of like, if an adopted kid goes to a Christian home, it's a good home, or like Christianity is synonymous with goodness and good personness. And like, while I'm not going to act like there aren't good Christians out there, I think you can really see how that Christianity is like a system that is built to control your mind, and make you think that these people are good and worth listening to and worth following, when in reality they don't live up to the same standards that they hold all of these people to. These people are giving 10% of their income because they're afraid that if they don't do that, they're not going to be successful, or God won't be happy with them, or maybe they're going to go to hell or something. And meanwhile, the people who are telling them all of that and instilling those fears in them have absolutely no burden. They don't carry that same weight upon themselves. And I think this is the kind of thing why the religious nuns are becoming such a large category, because I think it's kind of getting old. I think people are starting to see, the consistent abuse of church leaders in so many denominations across Christianity.
And that's another place where I think that this really, really is newsworthy, because they talk about his history of just really, really pushing membership and pushing tithing, and a lot of the quotes that came from congregants were that he was always pushing for that 10%, donate, donate, donate. And so it was really all about the money and all about growing the church. And so that is where I really think that to me, this is like a clear cut case of being swindled. Like, these people are being swindled, right? And you can put it under the blanket of religious belief and say, well, I'm allowed to because it's a religious institution and we're allowed to do this. But there's got to be some oversight that catches these sort of contradictory behaviors and holds those people responsible. Because in any other context, this is a manipulation and swindling. It's completely illegal. In the context of, oh, but he's a church leader, now suddenly it's okay. And then I can't remember who said it earlier. I think it was Richard Gilliver. Was like, there's already a built-in defense system where it's like, well, even Christians sin and we all make mistakes, even the leaders, and none of us are blameless, none of us are perfect, And so it's almost got this built-in self-defense system where you can't now come after it and say, no, this guy all along, he's swindling people out of their money, and this needs to be stopped and shut down, and he needs to be punished for that. Like, screw the affair part. Like, that's bad enough as it is. Don't get me wrong, but this is financially, it's a lot more than that. Like, he should be held responsible for that. And that umbrella of religion really protects a lot of people like him. And this is a good example of that.
Yeah, definitely, and it highlights. It's another case. I was going to say, because saying it highlights makes it sound like an isolated incident. It's another incident that highlights the fact that maybe churches should be held up to scrutiny of the finances and where that money's going to, and not just hide behind the kind of shield of charity to be able to not have to declare that. I think it's important for, especially as a parishioner, someone who goes to this church, someone who's spending their hard-earned money to kind of sustain these things, these churches, that they have that the right and the ability to see where that money is going to see how much of it is going to growing the church, which you could argue isn't like misspending if it's actually
Right.
growing the church. But also to see how much of it is going into the pastor's private kind of financial gain and the charity work. There's nothing wrong. I don't see why anyone who is honest and above board would object to having the finances scrutinized like that.
Yeah, I honestly kind of think that churches should be more scrutinized than other. If you're saying I have the holy high ground and I have the truth and the morals and the way, A, what do you have to hide? But B, shouldn't a claim like that require a little bit more scrutiny? Like, rather than being exempt from financial scrutiny, shouldn't they be scrutinized even more so? Because that is definitely a tactic in which people can use to take advantage of other people easily, and we've seen it done time and time and time again. So that pretty much sums up the article, but I wanted to give you guys a quick second for any closing thoughts if anybody has any. Was there anything else you guys wanted to add before we move on?
Yeah, for me, the real sad case of this story is those who've, as I mentioned earlier, who've left the church and have not taken the opportunity to question their own beliefs or own faith.
Yeah.
It was a perfect opportunity that arose where they could apply skepticism, but instead they've just gone for like self-blame and finger pointing, and that to me is sad, to miss that opportunity to, they've blamed Pastor Smith, but the culprit in all of this is religion itself. That's the underlying thing that's made this possible.
Yeah. Well said.
I agree.
Yeah.